At the end of this video, you should know which parts of setting up a chatbot using Google Dialogflow requires that you actually write code in Java, JavaScript, Python, whatever language. Before we get into the nitty gritty of actually configuring a chatbot, it's important that you understand the big picture of how conversation flows in Dialogflow and what are the different components that work behind the scenes to make your chatbot possible. Typically, the front facing portion of a chatbot is on a website or a mobile app. The user of this mobile app, let's say, wants to ask it a question. What's the weather like today? Can you book me a hotel room? Can you tell me what the current score of the NBA game is? This bot is integrated with Dialogflow and it sends along the text fragment which the user typed into its chat window along to Dialogflow. And this is where all the processing begins. The user's query is sent along to an agent. An agent is basically the chatbot itself. It's a programming module which is capable of understanding what the user said. This it does by using machine learning algorithms such as natural language processing. It is this agent's job to figure out what it was that the user meant based on the text fragment that was passed into Dialogflow. The agent then maps it to something called an intent. What was the goal that the user expected to accomplish with this query? All of the steps that we've seen so far are still within Dialogflow. It is now, once we have the user's intent, that we can call third party code which runs on a server somewhere. Now, where does this third party code run? It can be anywhere. It can be a cloud function on the Google Cloud platform, it can be Lambdas on AWS, or it can be any code that you've hosted on a server somewhere. The intent of the user, along with all the other information that you have about the user's request, is sent along to this external code, which then executes, maybe query some API, perform some processing, and once it's figured out the answer to the user's query, it sends this response back to the agent. The agent then further propagates this response through the Dialogflow integration with the app and finally to the user. This response is once again in the form of a chat message, and the user gets a chat response to the question he or she asked. There are lots of common terms or concepts used to define what we just saw in this big picture. Let's try and understand some of these. The text fragment, the phrase, or the sentence that the user uses to construct his query or the conversation snippet is called user expression. The user expression is essentially the questions that you might ask the chatbot or statements that you make to it. Now, the user might have typed this question into the chat window that popped up in the website or web application that you have developed, and you might have integrated with Dialogflow using the SDKs that they provide. Or it's a common messaging platform where you've integrated with Dialogflow using the one click integration. Platforms which work with Dialogflow are Kik, Viber, Facebook Messenger, Slack, amongst others. The agent sounds very fancy and it's also represented by a robot here, but it's just a programming module. This program is capable of applying natural language processing to the text fragment that it receives to understand what it was that the user meant. What is the goal that the user is trying to accomplish with this query? When we say that you're configuring a chatbot, what you're really configuring is an agent, the programming module. It is the responsibility of the agent to transform user requests to actionable data. And it is this actionable data that is passed on to the code at the back end, which executes to fulfill this request. Once the agent has understood what the user meant, the agent maps the user request to something called an intent. The intent is something which you as a developer have to define. So the agent can only map to those intents which you have configured. You can think of the intent as the different actions that your code can execute. Can the code retrieve information, update information, delete information? Retrieve, update, and delete can all be intents that you set up. This intent is passed along to the code that is running on some machine somewhere. This code executes to fulfill the intent of the user. This part is called fulfillment. Once the code that's running on a server somewhere has fulfilled the user's request, all it has to do is to send a response back to the user with the information that he or she requested. This response is in the form of a text message and it's sent back to the user. The server sends it back to the agent. The agent then sends it back to the Dialogflow integration with the chat app or the SDK or your website or web application, and finally, the text message is displayed to the user. Now, this flow of conversation has a lot of moving parts, but Dialogflow is so simple that you don't need to worry about most of it. You have a simple intuitive UI to configure the agents. So, all this mapping to an intent, etc., is purely configuration work that you need to do as a developer. You don't need to write any code for that. And really, when you use Dialogflow, the only code that you need to write is the one that runs on the server in order to fulfill the user's request. This is where you'll connect to different APIs, get the information that the user needs, and send it back to the user. Everything else is just configuration. This is the only portion where actual code is needed. From the diagram, which shows the big picture of what actually happens behind the scenes in Google's dialog flow, it's pretty obvious that the main portion where we need to write code is where we host the code on a server to fulfill the user's request. All the rest of the interactions are within Dialogflow and they only require that the developer configure the settings based on what chatbot you want to build. The actual code is only for fulfillment.